Okay, and the point of this video is to give you some homework support. I will be doing a few more of these on the lead up to your exam. So obviously this is for year 10 and year 11 who have got the same question to do for their homework this week. The question that you've been asked to do is the development of the smallpox vaccine was the biggest development in preventing illness in the years 1700 to 1900. How far do you agree? There's quite a few things you need to think about in this. It's a 16 marker. The focus of the question is getting you to focus on the development of the smallpox vaccine. So that should definitely be what your agree paragraph is. But then it goes on to say the biggest development in preventing illness. So when we're looking at what prevention of illness means, we really need to be thinking about ways in which disease was stopped before people got it. It's really important to get that definition right. And the last thing is we've got to focus on the dates, which clearly are 1700 to 1900. Now, as mentioned before, if you get these dates wrong in this part of the exam, then ultimately the exam board will give you nothing because it's very clear in their expectations. So this is the industrial period, preventing illness, and it's asking you, was the smallpox vaccine the biggest development? Now, what does development mean? That's another question you need to ask yourself. By development, we talk about how much change, what happened because of it. If something develops, it moves forward. Now, with every individual in this time period, there was definitely some positives and definitely some negatives. And you need to be able to, in the 16 marker, show an element of opinion throughout, which will allow the examiner to see that you've got that development of how far do you agree throughout your response. So in your homework, I've put this in your booklets. You need an agree section, which talks about the smallpox vaccine. Give 3 lots of SFD, which is detailed, which is explained. What development did it cause? Then give an overall. Then disagree. It wasn't the biggest development. So you could talk about negatives and opposition, which I'll talk about shortly. But you could also say there were other developments which were a bigger aspect in prevention of disease. And for this video, it will be snow and government and public health. Please also make sure that you develop your GON conclusion, which will show a consistent aspect of opinion. So give a judgment. Was the smallpox vaccine the biggest development? Explain why using your SFD. On the other hand, what else should we look at throughout to make sure that we've got that broad and balanced opinion? And nevertheless, what is your final answer? And give a final piece of SFD. So what we're going to do just for the next sort of 6-7 minutes is go through each aspect of this question. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Edward Jenner. So you must show in the exam that you know exactly what the person did. If you're too vague in your approach to this, then it won't be getting the high level 3, level 4 responses, and it will just be a vague response, which won't allow your explanation to be good because your evidence isn't either. So what did he do? So one of the first groundbreaking things was Jenner's use of vaccinations, as it saved people from catching smallpox. It's really important there that we understand that smallpox was an incredibly deadly disease that would kill 1 in 3 people. If you caught smallpox, there was no treatment, you would die. And just to put it into context, around this time, smallpox was as frightening as the plague had been. So it was something that had outbreaks and epidemics a lot in the 1700s, but people were petrified of catching it due to the fact that you would die if you caught it. Now, what Jenner did in the 1790s is he tested the theory that those who caught cowpox would be less likely to catch smallpox. People who caught cowpox wouldn't die, they'd just get a rash, possibly a fever, but they would not die. He observed milkmaids who were more likely to catch cowpox as they worked with cows on a daily basis. But to do this, he needed to test his theory. And he tested his theory on a young boy called James Phipps, who was 9 years of age. He infected him with cowpox, and then he went back and infected him with smallpox. Now, in those days, the way in which they infected, what they would do is they would get the pus from a victim or a sufferer or someone who had died and rub it in a small wound. Then that would be a way of passing it on. Now, there was a group of people that did this, but these were called inoculators. The only difference with these people was that inoculators gave a full dose of the illness. which is a big problem because number one, that could cause death. Number two, it could cause an epidemic. And number three, it would be very expensive for the government, who would have to isolate people who caught that illness. So once he tested it on this young boy called James Phipps, it proved to work. Now, he did this numerous other times. So he retried his theory, and then in 1798, he published his book, Inquiry of the Variola Vaccinae, describing how to prevent smallpox by infecting people with cowpox. He called it vaccinations, as vacca is the Latin for cow. It was a good alternative to inoculation, which killed more people than it helped. So that's the SFD. That's what Jenner did. Next thing is positives and negatives. So good things. Jenner's vaccine was a much safer option than inoculation and cheaper for the government, as they didn't need to quarantine people after vaccination. The vaccines were made compulsory by the government, which meant people had to have it in a strict manner in 1871. The death rate dropped to 50 people per million in regards to smallpox. So there was a lot less people dying if they had the vaccination. Thirdly, by the 1970s, smallpox was wiped out worldwide. Now, when we're looking at developments, you can look at short term and long term. It doesn't just need to be what happened the next day or the next week. It could be months, years. And as a result of the starter work of Jenner and his vaccination, smallpox does become eventually wiped out a couple of hundred years later. Further to this, we've also got a link ideas. So because of Jenner's work, when the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch was known, so the development of germ theory and the development of linking germs to diseases, vaccines did become more effective in dealing with a range of diseases. So it could be seen that Jenner provided the platform for future work once the scientific understanding had been developed by Pasteur and Koch. And also, Jenner did show the importance of observing the scientific method. So although it wasn't a scientifically proven method, the fact that observation was key to this was really important and provided a platform in that development of observational laboratory work moving forward. Negative. Stopping smallpox wasn't new. So the fact is, inoculators had been used to prevent smallpox. And even after the vaccine, a lot of rich people still used inoculations because they didn't trust the vaccine, because they believed that it would turn you into a cow because it was driven by cowpox. Vaccination was not enforced for many years after. So governments didn't want to force people to vaccinate their children until the 1870s. Although it became compulsory, this was 70 years after Edward Jenner's findings. So Edward Jenner was actually dead by the time his vaccine had become compulsory for all. Another negative to look at is the fact that at the time, vaccinations didn't lead to other breakthroughs. So this vaccination for Edward Jenner could be seen as a one-off, as it was a connection between cowpox and smallpox. A lot of people at the time were very negative. There was an anti-Jennerian society who thought that actually his work couldn't be matched. It was a one-off. It was pure luck. Which leads nicely into the last negative, much opposition. Inoculators were angry that they were being forced out of work. The church didn't agree with using animals, and the Royal Society didn't like the fact that there wasn't enough science to back up Jenner's work. So there was a lot of opposition to Jenner's vaccine, which, again, you need to judge this. How much of a development was it? Was it overwhelmingly positive, or do the negatives undermine the positive aspect? This is what you need to show in any 16-marker analysis question, which needs to have an evaluation throughout. The second person to look at is John Snow. So in your disagree section, you could argue that there were further developments which caused more change moving forward. Now, again, that's up to you with your evaluation and your opinion throughout. So firstly, what did John Snow do? He worked on trying to prove that cholera was not caused by miasma, and it was caused by dirty drinking water in the Broad Street pump in Soho, London. Cholera was very dangerous, very similar to smallpox. If you caught it, you would likely die. You could pass about 20 litres of diarrhea a day. If it was caught, it would be likely death. Now, John Snow worked on preventing cholera by using the Broad Street pump in 1849. He published a book saying that people caught cholera from water they used from washing and drinking, not from bad air, mainly because cholera affected the stomach, not the lungs, and miasma is seen as linking as an airborne illness that causes your lungs to fail. In 1854, John Snow made this link with the Broad Street pump after an epidemic of the illness. Snow created a map of people who died from the disease, realizing that the pump was central to their main water source. There were some cases he had to look into further. So a woman who died several miles away found that she drank water from the Broad Street pump as she liked the taste of it. She had it delivered. He also noticed that workers in a brewery near the pump didn't die. Well, that's because they'd been drinking beer and not water. Snow removed the handle, and this led to cases dropping significantly. Now, this is where the overall message of John Snow is he made a case to disprove the fact that cholera was not caused by miasma. Okay, we'll just add something in there. It was not. Okay, that's really important. So, the positives of this individual and the negatives. We need to think about this. So, John Snow saved a lot of people's lives from cholera in 1854. Snow's work was considered more after the Great Stink of 1858. Now, the Great Stink of 1858 is when the River Thames evaporated and there was this link that water could cause cholera. Snow's work also got people to start thinking about the downsides of miasma as a cause of illness. It didn't change it, but it got people thinking. And you could argue that John Snow's actions eventually led to the Public Health Act of 1875. However, we've got to be careful with that because the government are a big role to play as well, which you'll see in the next few slides. Negatives. Again, needs to be argued that without the work of Pasteur, nobody really understood why water was causing cholera. And also Robert Koch, he found the bacteria that caused cholera. So you could argue that actually Snow's work was not as relevant until the work of Pasteur and Koch. The government did not act until they had solid proof. So ultimately, the government, the wealthy, didn't want to pay tax for water supplies, and people didn't want to get the government to get involved. So unless the government had concrete scientific fact, they didn't really make much leeway in moving forward, which is why some people might say that the Public Health Act of 1875 was more of a development than the actual actions of John Snow. Linking to that as well, some old methods were used to try and get rid of cholera, which suggests that people didn't really understand the concept of it. So praying, we're talking 1858 here, 1854, sorry. People are still praying to try and remove cholera. Burning tar and vinegar to remove bad air. These are actions that people did during the plague. So you could argue that the negatives is that actually John Snow's work didn't cause far-reaching change in how to treat and also prevent illness, which is the focus of this question. The third thing you talk about in prevention in this period is public health. Now, the key thing with this is public health is driven by the government. That's really important to understand, is that public health is about how people's health is dealt with in a public manner. Now, I'll just give you the quick backdrop of this before we go into it in a bit more detail. So alongside the scientific methods, a lot was done to develop with living conditions. So at the time, Britain was going through the Industrial Revolution and there were millions of people moving to England, and England wasn't ready for it. In 1700, at the start of this period, the government had a laissez-faire attitude, which meant they did not think it was their responsibility to interfere. But this changed a lot during this period. By the 1800s, the attitudes were changing. More men had the right to vote, so the government needed to pass laws to keep people happy. But also, cholera kept arriving in England. So there's 4 stages here that we need to look at. The person that got people thinking, Edward Chadwick, the first Public Health Act, the failure of that, government intervention in the 60s, but then the second Public Health Act of 1875 and the development that caused in the prevention of illness. So what you've got here is just a really quick breakdown. Now remember, the focus of this question isn't just spieling off knowledge, it's about what development. So you've got Edwin Chadwick at the start. Now he got people thinking that people living in cities had a lower life expectancy, mainly because of their living conditions. He said it was down to filthy conditions, and he wanted all cities to have a board of health who would be responsible for supplying clean water and disposing sewage. but there isn't much impact. He got people thinking, but he needed more evidence to support his theory. So this is where you could make a clever link. Did Jon Snow's work help push this, or is the government more important? You could link Pasteur and Koch into this, but be careful because the question is based on prevention. The government attempted in 1848 to introduce a Public Health Act. The point was to improve sanitary conditions, so cleanliness. They asked cities to set up boards of health, but they didn't tell cities. To set up a board of health would have included money, would have cost a lot of money, so a lot of cities weren't in the position to do this at this time. It was not compulsory. People either ignored it or they couldn't afford it. As the chronology goes on, in 1858, the government paid $3 million for a sewage system after the Great Stink. So some may argue that the Great Stink was a big driver. If the Great Stink didn't happen, where the Thames evaporated and the disgusting stench in London, would the government have acted? So you could have that argument there that this was a driver. Louis Pasteur's work did have a huge impact in 1861 because we finally knew that germs did cause decay. So from the mid-1860s, you had London, 1,300 miles of sewers. Birmingham, slums were demolished. In Leeds, local businesses obtained a court order to prevent sewage from being drained into rivers. Cities were now caring a lot more than what they did 20 years previously when they attempted the first Public Health Act. So by 1875, what massive development happened? The second Public Health Act, which everyone had to do. Everyone has the responsibility now to provide clean water. Well, what development would that cause? Preventing cholera. Get rid of sewage effectively rather than dumping it in the rivers. Build public toilets to ensure that the spread of disease wasn't going to happen if you're throwing your waste into the street. Housing was of a better quality and not the cramped back-to-back housing. Giving people a chance for exercise and also checking quality of food in shops to make sure they didn't contain anything that could cause harm. So the government had a central part to make sure that people's health improved. So at this time, this is where your opinion is really important. So going back to that question that you have to do for your homework, it's really important that you show opinion throughout. Agree smallpox was a big development. We can't argue against that. But in the disagree, you've got to show that opinion. What else happened? What opposition was there to smallpox? Make sure that this answer shows significant SFD, but a balanced conclusion and evaluation throughout the response.